Hey everybody, it's great to see you today. Welcome to Living Power, your online Bible study where we are walking through the Bible in a year. Today is September 20th, and we are continuing in the book of Nehemiah. We are reliving the story of the exiles' return to Israel, their rebuilding of the temple, their rebuilding of their homes, their rebuilding of the wall, they're getting readjusted, getting settled. Yesterday we talked about revival and how Ezra read the book of the law to all of the people, probably a delegation of at least 50,000, well maybe almost 50,000, this huge population. And today we're going to read about their response after hearing the word of the Lord, after hearing the precious word of Scripture, and the Spirit, just pierced their heart and convicted them. Today we read about the vow that they make to live a life pleasing to the Lord. And what I'd like to do is talk just a little bit about the components of that vow, making sure we understand exactly what they were agreeing to, what they were committing to. And we, of course, will have an application for our own lives at the end. We can only imagine how long it took for Ezra to have read the book. Today, we're learning that they stood for 3 hours in hearing this, and then they stood another 3 hours as they confessed their sin and their brokenness to the Lord. This is 6-hour church. Can you imagine? And the people were just in revival. They were eating it up. They were not in any rush to go home. They were not in any rush to go to lunch. They were just in revival. 6 hours. That makes me think sometimes when we hear a prayer that's 2 or 3 minutes long, if it reaches into 3 or 4 minutes, we're thinking, oh, when is this prayer going to quit? Not so in this case. What has happened to our ability, our sensitivity, that we get angry if church lasts over an hour, if a prayer lasts over 3 or 4 minutes? See here the people's zeal for hearing the word, that they just didn't want to go home. I love that. Now, they make a vow today, and did you notice that they actually agreed to put it in writing? They really were committed to the Lord. They really wanted to do exactly as the law said, and they were responding to what they heard. They said, I have about 8 things that consisted of this vow, this promise. This wasn't a Nazirite vow. This was just a promise that they were making to the Lord. So let's look at this. The first thing they said, we will not intermarry with anyone outside of our people. As the Lord has commanded us, we will keep the line pure. Number 2, they would not buy or sell anything on the Sabbath. They would keep the Sabbath day holy. Number 3, they would let the land rest every 7 years. And had their ancestors ever done this before? No. That was part of the reason for the exile and this period of 490 years, because every 7th year they were supposed to let the land rest and not plow and not plant, and they had never ever done that. Number 4, they talked about paying the annual temple tax, and we read about this at the very beginning of the Old Testament when we were in the book of the law. And this temple tax supported the priests and the Levites, and the festivals that they had, and just the responsibilities and the duties that they undertook. So this helped them. I'm going to give you a little hint. In Nehemiah 13, you're going to read that in a little while. They did not do this. I probably shouldn't have spoiled it for you. I'm sorry if I told you the ending of the story and you wanted to wait and read it for yourself. But that was one thing that they don't do it. They don't do it. Number 5, they promised to bring the wood to the temple. Why did they need the wood? Well, they needed the wood to burn the burnt offerings. So that was part of the sacrifice. And number 6, they promised to bring the first fruits to the priests. This was the first fruits of their produce, their firstborn in their flocks. And this command, you can look that up in Exodus 23, verse 19. The number 7 in the vow is that they were to bring their tithe to the Levites. You can find the reference to this in Leviticus 27, verse 30. And a tenth of the tithe went to the priests. So the tithe went to the Levites, a tenth of the tithe went to the priests. And then number 8, they were not going to neglect the temple. They were not going to let the facility itself go into disrepair. They were going to keep that up, paying into I guess out of their own money, what they would need to keep that up. And all of these provisions were for ongoing worship of the people. God had ordained the people, the Israelites, to do these things, to keep up with the maintenance of things, to support the Lord's priests, and just for ongoing worship. And that's really what we're seeing here. There is a difference between first fruits and the tithe. I don't know if you know the difference. The first fruits had to do with things that God produced. It never had to do with money. First fruits always had to do with things that only God can do. So if you harvest produce, that's a first fruit. If, in their cases, they were breeding sheep and goats and things like that, well, only God can bring new life into being. And so the first fruits only represented what God can do, and these were offerings brought to the priests. The priests were different from the Levites, right? Because it had to do with the bloodline. The priests came from the line of Aaron, and specifically because he was the high priest. So that they had a specific line. The tithe, on the other hand, was 10%. And we can relate that into our day. It has to do with giving of our resources, a tenth of our resources. And the tithe went to the Levites. So I just thought that was interesting, the designation between that. When my husband and I built a garden this summer, and we wanted to see what life was like when you kind of self-sustain. What would it be like to actually be able to go out in the garden and get some produce and cook it that night for dinner? We even created an herb garden, and I have basil and rosemary and thyme. And when I make, like last night, I made spaghetti, and I went into the garden and I got a couple of sprigs of the basil and I chopped it up and I put that in with some olive oil and my onions and a little bit of salt. And then I went to the other side of the garden and I got tomatoes, and I took the skins off after boiling those for just a quick minute, and put that in the food processor and made my own sauce. Love the garden. I absolutely love it. But when I was reading about the first fruits, I thought, well, how in the world could I give today the first fruits of my garden? And so what I decided to do, maybe you know of a better idea, something that I should have done differently, but what I decided to do was to take the first fruit of my produce. I harvested cucumbers this year and green peppers this year and lots of tomatoes, and I took a portion of the first of that to my pastor at church, and I just gave that as a free will offering, as a gift to him, and he and his family were able to enjoy that. So that's how I thought maybe a contemporary application of this gift of this requirement of the first fruit, that I could actually do that. And they were blessed and I was blessed in the giving. We can glean an application from this lesson today, in that there's a difference between commitment and action. The people were so committed after hearing the word of the Lord to doing these things. They wrote it down on paper. I mean, they were committed. They were on fire. They just knew that they were going to do these things. Well, I've kind of already spoiled it for you that they didn't follow every one of these things to the letter. And isn't that true of our life today, though? There are times in our life where we are committed, but there is a difference between commitment and action. I have a confession. I cannot tell you how many times over my life I have been committed to starting an exercise program and to seeing it through. And inevitably, I have learned over the past 20 years of trying to do these things when I really thought, well, I'm getting older, I really need to start an exercise program. What's the first thing that I would start to do? I would go out and buy something. I would buy a new exercise outfit, or I would buy a DVD, or I would buy a VHS tape. Long time ago when I would try to start these exercise programs. I've bought an exercise bike. I bought a treadmill. All of these things, and inevitably, the commitment that I had, I would even buy books and I would read about the importance of an exercise program. Some of the time, after I bought these items, I was still committed, yet I had not taken the action. And I can't tell you how many years my treadmill sat in the basement unused. And it was almost like buying these things was the action that I thought would get me there, reading a book, buying this piece of equipment, but it never did because I never followed through. Commitment is different from action. And so I've come to realize that tendency when I want to get started with something is to go out and purchase something new, and I've halted that activity. That's something that recently I've said, no, that is not going to help me get to my goal. I actually have to walk. I actually have to run. I actually have to use the equipment that I have. And I'm so excited that I've actually, again, committed to an exercise program, and I think I'm doing something now with my treadmill that I can actually stick with. So pray for me that my commitment equals my action yet again. And here in the reading today, we see the people being committed spiritually to doing something that they knew that they were being commanded by the Lord. So, there's a difference between reading the Word and applying it to our life. So I don't know how long you in particular have been going through this study, how long you've been reading the Bible, but here's my question for you today. As you're reading it, are you able to pull out applications, and are you letting the Word change your life? Either changing the way you think, changing the way you act, but you're not getting stuck at the point of commitment, are you? Because the people in today's reading got stuck. I have gotten stuck with many times in trying to exercise. I get stuck at the point of commitment. There is a difference between reading the Word and doing what it says. How many times have we read, and obey, and obey, and obey? That is a timeless truth that the Lord is looking for His people. Jesus, even when He came in the New Testament we're going to read, many times He says, my children obey my voice. It's not enough just to be committed, for God requires from us faithful action on our part. So these people wrote down how they were committed. If the Lord came to you today and said, I would really like to see a greater commitment in a particular area of your life, what would He say that area was? If He asked you to write down a covenant, write down a promise, if He asked you, just like these people did, what would He be wanting you to commit to? What area of your life would He want you to be focused on? Well, that's a great question for all of us. And the people responded today wholeheartedly, yes, we will. And in the coming days, you're going to read and see exactly how they were able to be successful and where they perhaps fell short. Well, my prayer for you is that you would remain strong through the end of the Old Testament, that you would remain strong as we begin the New Testament here in a couple of days, and be not only fully committed, but fully able and willing to take the action that you feel the Lord is calling you to do today, whatever that may be. Well, I pray that this has been a blessing to you today. Blessings to you and your family. Until we meet again, shalom.